It was a warm Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sun lazily streamed through the large windows of our dining room, casting soft golden light over the table. The faint clinking of glasses and quiet hum of casual conversation lingered in the air. Another Sunday brunch, another perfect family gathering. Or so I thought. I had just finished clearing the last of the plates when I felt the faintest presence behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Veronica, my mother-in-law, had a way of looming in the background, always watching, always calculating, even when she wasn't the one speaking. "Ella, dear," she called out, her voice smooth, practiced, like she had been rehearsing the words in her mind for days. I glanced up, my hand still gripping the edge of a plate as I wiped it down, my movements deliberate, almost mechanical. "Yes, Veronica?" I replied, keeping my tone polite, even though I felt the familiar stir of tension creeping in. She stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, the sound unmistakable. Veronica always wore heels, no matter the occasion. It was as though they were part of her armor, her shield against the world. But today there was something more to it, a glint in her eye that I couldn't quite place, something far colder than the usual indifference she reserved for me. "Ella, honey," she began, her voice lowering to a whisper, just enough for only me to hear. "Let's not drag this out." She tilted her head slightly, adjusting the diamond bracelet that glinted too brightly against her wrist. "You need to leave my son." My breath hitched in my chest, and for a split second, the room around me seemed to blur. The silverware I held suddenly felt heavier in my hands, its weight more than just metal. It was as though the whole world shifted in that instant, as if the very foundation of everything I knew was trembling. I exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to let my shock show on my face. Instead, I gave her the smile I had perfected over the years, the one that was sweet and unassuming, the one that hid all the thoughts and feelings I kept buried beneath the surface. The smile that said, "I'm not bothered by you." The one that made her uneasy, though she probably didn't even realize it. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I asked, leaning in slightly, making sure to look at her with genuine curiosity. She seemed to take my calmness as submission, her confidence growing. "You heard me." Her voice was silky now, dripping with the kind of practiced sweetness that only mothers-in-law seem to master. "I said you need to leave Jason." She let the words linger in the air between us, thick with a subtle threat. I could feel the eyes of everyone else in the room, unaware of the tension simmering just beyond their casual conversation. Jason was laughing with his father across the room, blissfully ignorant of the bomb his mother had just dropped on us. "You've had your fun?" Veronica continued smoothly, adjusting her bracelet once more, as though the movement was a necessary part of this grand performance. "But you must see it, don't you? You're not the right fit for our family. Not good enough." I could hear the venom in her words, and yet, I wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time she'd made such a comment, though usually, it was far more subtle. The jabs at my upbringing, the quiet dismissals of my accomplishments, the constant reminder that I didn't come from the right background, that I didn't have the right family name. But today she was laying it all bare. No more pretenses, no more careful words. "You don't have the right background," she pressed, her voice thick with condescension. "No prestigious family name, no valuable connections. A woman like you?" She trailed off, as if she had already said enough, as if her words alone were enough to make me crumble at her feet. I set the plate down carefully, though I could feel the tension in the air tightening around me, constricting, suffocating. It would have been easy to let the anger rise, to lash out, but that wasn't my game. I had learned long ago that silence was far more powerful than any words I could throw at her. She misread my calmness as submission, just as I had expected. "Don't look so surprised, dear," she added, her smile widening, smug and self-assured. "Daniel will remarry. We'll find someone more suitable for him. Someone with the right family, the right class. You understand, don't you?" I swallowed the lump in my throat, a small, almost imperceptible breath escaping from my lips. "I understand perfectly," I thought to myself. I had heard these words before, always disguised in nicer packaging, But this time, there would be no polite smile from me. There would be no hint of submission, no playing along. No, today was different. I understand perfectly, I said aloud, matching her sweetness with a calm, almost pitying tone. I didn't wait for her to respond. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked away. I left her standing there, stunned, confused by my lack of resistance. She had expected me to crumble, to beg, to plead for her approval. But I had done none of that. Instead, I had simply smiled, walked away, and let her stew in the discomfort of not getting what she wanted. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't the one who was about to lose anything. The house she adored showing off to her friends? It wasn't Daniel's. It was mine. The successful business she had belittled and called my little project? It had outgrown everything Daniel had ever accomplished. The luxurious vacations she boasted about, the expensive gifts she took for granted, they didn't come from her family's wealth. They came from the empire I had built, my empire. She thought she had won. She had no idea that she had already lost. The next few days passed in a blur, with the weight of Veronica's words hanging in the air like an uninvited guest. I kept up the charade, smiling when Jason was around, pretending everything was fine. I could hear her voice in my head, repeating her cruel words. Not good enough. You don't belong. We'll find someone better. But while she believed she had the upper hand, I knew something she didn't. She had no idea just how wrong she was. No idea that every word she'd thrown at me, every veiled insult about my background, every quiet dismissal of my achievements, had been based on a lie. Veronica, in her infinite arrogance, had no clue that I had built everything she thought was hers. The house, the business, the vacations, the luxury, all of it my empire, not Jason's, not Veronica's, mine. I had worked relentlessly for years to build something that was entirely my own. She thought I was some kind of kept woman, living off the wealth of my husband. She thought I was just a lucky girl who had married well. But the truth was far more satisfying, and far more dangerous for her. You see, the house she so proudly strutted around in, showing it off to her friends as the family estate, was not Jason's. I had bought it before we were even married. Everything, every inch of that mansion, every marble countertop, every gleaming window that looked out over the city skyline, was mine. Paid for with my own money in my own name. Jason had barely contributed to the property taxes, let alone the mortgage. But no one knew this. Not Veronica, not Jason. They both believed that the life we lived, the life I had carefully curated, was entirely due to Jason's so-called success. And the business Veronica had always belittled as my little project, the one she insisted was nothing more than a hobby, a passing interest? Well, she had no idea that it had long since outgrown Jason's entire career. My business wasn't just successful. It was thriving, expanding, and most importantly, independent. While she thought she had orchestrated the perfect marriage of status and wealth, the truth was that I was the one holding all the strings. Veronica's assumption that I had nothing, that I was nothing, was her greatest mistake. And while I had to keep my composure for Jason's sake, I couldn't help but smile to myself at how beautifully this was all unfolding. She had no idea that the very house she admired, the very life she thought was a reflection of her family's wealth, was a lie. And it wasn't just any lie, it was my truth. But as the days passed, I could see Jason beginning to shift. His usual relaxed demeanor had been replaced by an edge of uncertainty. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, and I made no effort to explain it. After all, he was too far gone, too lost in his mother's manipulations to see the truth. But eventually, reality would catch up with him. Before I share what happened next, the moment that completely turned Jason's world upside down and left him scrambling for answers, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my amazing viewers. I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And while you're at it, if you've ever had to stand your ground when others underestimated you, hit that like button. Trust me, this story is just getting started. So stay tuned, because the moment Veronica thought she had the upper hand, everything was about to change. The days that followed were a delicate dance of careful observation. Veronica, never one to let an opportunity slip through her fingers, wasted no time in launching her campaign. It started subtly, like the quiet pressure of a storm gathering on the horizon. Just a whisper here, a pointed remark there. But each comment she made to Jason, cloaked in false concern, was calculated to wear him down, to make him doubt me, to make him question everything we had built together. You know, Jason, she would begin, her voice as sweet as honey. I've been thinking about everything lately. Ella's a lovely girl, but I just don't think she understands our way of life. Maybe it's time for you to start looking at someone who fits in better. Someone who really gets it. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every word was designed to plant a seed of doubt, to make him question whether I truly belonged in their world. And Jason, poor soul, seemed to swallow every word without hesitation, never once suspecting the true motive behind her carefully measured words. I could see it in his eyes, the slight hesitation, the occasional furrow in his brow when she would make these suggestions. But still, he laughed it off, convinced that his mother was just looking out for him, that she only wanted what was best. And that was the most dangerous part. Jason had no idea what was happening. He was still in the thick of it, completely unaware of the manipulation at play. Meanwhile, Veronica was growing bolder, emboldened by the thought that she could convince her son to turn against me. One afternoon, as I prepared dinner, I overheard her talking to him in the next room. I could hear her voice low and insistent, though I couldn't make out every word. But the tone was unmistakable. It was the same tone she had used when she had first confronted me. The kind of tone that was both soothing and controlling, as if she had the answers to all of life's problems. She just doesn't get it, Jason, I heard her say, her voice dripping with concern. She wasn't raised like we were. She doesn't understand the responsibilities that come with our name. I know you love her, but love isn't always enough. You need someone who can fit in, someone who can be part of our family, not someone who is just holding you back. The words stung, but I didn't let them show. I simply continued chopping vegetables, my hands moving with precision, my mind calculating the next step. I didn't need to rush. Veronica thought she was playing a game, but she didn't know that I was already 10 steps ahead. The days turned into weeks, and Veronica's campaign intensified. She would find small ways to undermine my position, constantly reminding Jason of how unsuitable I was. Yet, every time she spoke, I only became more resolved. Because the truth was, she had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought I was weak, that I was just some naive woman who had married well and would fall apart when faced with her manipulation. But what she didn't understand, what she could never understand, was that I didn't need Jason's family or anyone else to validate my worth. I had built my own life from scratch, and that was more than any family name or connection could ever provide. And so I let her talk. I let her scheme. The more she spoke, the more I stayed silent, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. Not with anger, but with understanding. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to beg for her approval. But I would never give her that satisfaction. I smiled inwardly, knowing the truth that she couldn't possibly fathom. The more she worked to tear me down, the more she was sealing her own fate. By now, Jason had begun to listen more closely. The cracks were beginning to show in his usual relaxed demeanor. He was starting to question things, though he still wasn't fully aware of how deep the manipulation ran. But I could see it, his hesitations were growing. And with every hesitation, I knew I was getting closer to the moment when he would finally understand everything. But that moment I knew would have to come on my terms, not Veronica's. The days seemed to stretch on, each one a slow and calculated march towards the inevitable. Veronica's subtle manipulation of Jason was becoming more transparent, but Jason, still blind to the truth, continued to dismiss her concerns as nothing more than his mother being, well, his mother. I had to admit I admired her persistence. But little did she know, her relentless efforts were only digging her own grave. It wasn't until one evening that the game began to shift. The night started like any other. Jason and I, sitting at the dinner table, me trying to make small talk, Jason absorbed in his phone, occasionally glancing up to ask how my day had been. I'd been so used to this routine, the ebb and flow of our conversations, that I almost didn't notice when the atmosphere in the room began to shift. It was subtle at first, but I could feel it in my bones. The tension was building, like the calm before a storm. And then I heard it. A voice, low and urgent, seeping through the thin walls that separated our living room from the kitchen. Veronica's voice. I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth. She was speaking to Jason, her words coated in that sickly sweet tone of concern. But there was an underlying edge, a sense of urgency that I had never heard before. You deserve better, Jason, she was saying. Ella just doesn't understand. She doesn't get the pressure of our world, the responsibilities that come with your name. She never will. You need someone who can stand beside you, someone who truly belongs in our circle. I could almost hear the calculated pause in her words as she let them hang in the air, as though she were planting a seed that would eventually grow into doubt. The longer she spoke, the more the room seemed to close in around me. Jason wasn't saying much. I could tell by the silence that he was listening. That was enough to set my heart racing. How much longer before he would finally start questioning things? How much longer until the weight of Veronica's words began to take root in his mind? But then came the words that would mark the turning point, the moment when everything would change. She's not good enough for you, Jason. I'm just looking out for you. You deserve someone who can be a true partner, someone who can help you carry the legacy of this family. There was a pause, followed by her voice softening, almost coaxing. Think about it, son. You have so much more to offer, and you don't need someone like Ella holding you back. She's not fit to be your wife. It's time to move on. My heart sank, but at the same time I felt something else. A cool, calculated calm settled over me. Veronica had just revealed her hand completely. She thought she could tear us apart, but what she didn't realize was that her words were no longer having the effect she intended. I pushed my chair back slowly, my footsteps soft on the hardwood floor, as I made my way to the door that separated the kitchen from the living room. My pulse was steady, my breath even, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on my chest. I reached for the door handle and paused, hearing Jason's hesitant voice on the other side. Mom, I don't know. I don't think. Before he could finish, I opened the door, stepping into the room with a deliberate calm that surprised even me. There they were, sitting together, Jason on the couch, Veronica beside him, her face painted with that false concern she wore so well. I think it's time we talk, I said, my voice steady but firm. Veronica's smile faltered for the briefest moment, though she quickly recovered, plastering on a look of confusion. Ella, darling, what's the matter? Is everything all right? I met her gaze, my own expression unreadable. I overheard everything, I said, my voice carrying just enough of a bite to let them know I wasn't going to back down. Jason's eyes widened, his face flushing with embarrassment. Ella, I didn't. It's all right, Jason, I interrupted, turning my attention to him now. You don't need to explain. I heard it all. Everything. Jason opened his mouth as though trying to formulate the right words, but he fell silent, the weight of the situation sinking in. Veronica, on the other hand, seemed to go on the defensive immediately. Ella, you're misunderstanding. I was just concerned for Jason. I want what's best for him. You know that. But I wasn't buying her act anymore. No, Veronica, I said, stepping further into the room. What you want is for me to disappear so that you can control everything again. You've made it crystal clear that I'm not good enough for your precious son. But what you don't know is that I've been letting you play this game while I've been quietly building my own empire. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the shift in her expression, the realization that she had underestimated me completely. What are you talking about? She spat, her voice a little sharper now. I took a deep breath, letting the tension hang in the air for a moment longer before I revealed the truth that had been waiting to be exposed. I own everything you've been parading around as your family's wealth. The house, the business, all of it. I built it, and while you were busy scheming, thinking you had control, you missed the most important part of the game. You thought I was just some helpless woman, clinging to your son. But the truth is, This, I gestured around the room, letting my words sink in, is mine. Veronica's face drained of color, her carefully maintained composure cracking in front of me. Jason, too, seemed frozen, the realization slowly dawning on him as his eyes shifted between Veronica and me. I smiled, not out of malice, but because I knew I had one. In that moment, the tables had completely turned. The truth was out, and Veronica had no idea how much she had already lost. And as Jason stood there, still processing what I had just revealed, I realized that the game was over. The truth had finally come to light. It was only a matter of time before the consequences caught up with them. The silence in the room was suffocating. Veronica's face had gone completely pale, her usually composed demeanor shattered. She opened and closed her mouth, searching for words that weren't coming. Jason, on the other hand, seemed like he had been hit by a freight train. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and confusion, as though the reality I had just laid out before him didn't quite fit with the world he had built in his mind. I let the silence stretch on, letting it sink in. Veronica's carefully constructed world of superiority and control was crumbling before her eyes, and I was more than willing to watch the pieces fall. It had taken years of hard work and careful planning, but the satisfaction of seeing her caught in her own lies made it all worthwhile. Ella, Jason finally spoke, his voice weak, strained. What are you talking about? His words trailed off, as if he couldn't fully comprehend the enormity of what I was telling him. I didn't need to repeat myself. The truth was right there, hanging in the air like an unspoken accusation. But Jason wasn't ready to face it yet. He wasn't ready to confront the woman he had married and the mother who had spent years manipulating him. And that's when I realized something. Jason had never really seen me, not for who I was and certainly not for what I had accomplished. He had always been content with his mother's influence, too blind to see the way I had quietly built a life for myself, independent of him and his family. He had never asked the right questions, never bothered to look past the surface. And now, as the truth came crashing down, I saw that he was more afraid of losing his image than he was of losing me. I crossed my arms, watching him carefully as his gaze flickered between me and his mother. His eyes filled with the kind of desperation that only comes when you realize you've been living a lie. Ella, I didn't know, he stammered, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to find his footing. I didn't know all of this. I thought it was. Enough, Jason. I cut him off, my voice sharp though calm. You don't have to explain yourself. The truth is right in front of you. It was never about me, was it? It was always about what your mother told you. Always about fitting into the world she created for you. A world where you had to conform, where you had to need her. His face flushed with guilt, but there was something else in his eyes now, fear. Fear that he had lost something he thought he could control, something that had once seemed like an easy path. But the path he had chosen was no longer available to him. I wasn't going to fight for him. I wasn't going to beg for him to stay. And that was something he didn't understand. I thought we were fine, Jason murmured, almost to himself, his voice hollow. I thought everything was perfect. But now I don't know what's real anymore. Nothing you thought was real, Jason? I said softly, my tone a mix of sadness and finality. Your mother sold you a story, and you bought it. I gave you everything, and you never once questioned it. You just believed that I was the one who wasn't good enough, that I was the one holding you back. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. But you were wrong, and now you'll have to live with that. Jason's gaze dropped to the floor. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of everything was finally catching up with him. And there it was, the realization. He had made a choice, and now it was too late to take it back. Veronica, still trying to regain some semblance of control, leaned forward. Jason, please don't listen to her. She's trying to manipulate you. She's playing games with your head. You know what's best for you. I know what's best for you. Her words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to salvage a situation she couldn't control. But it was Jason who needed to make the final decision, and the look in his eyes told me everything. He was lost. torn between the woman who had given him everything and the mother who had shaped his life, who had never let him stand on his own. For the first time in years, I saw Jason for who he truly was. A man who had never learned to think for himself, who had always relied on someone else to dictate his choices. And now, as the dust settled and the pieces of his world crumbled around him, he was finally facing the consequences of those choices. I don't know what to do," Jason admitted, his voice breaking as he turned towards me, his vulnerability now fully exposed. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can just walk away from everything." I could hear the panic in his voice, the fear that came with the realization that he had no control over his own life. And in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even asking for a chance to fix things. He was asking for someone to take responsibility for his decisions. But that wasn't something I could give him. "You made your choice, Jason," I said, my voice steady, though there was a certain sadness beneath it. "You chose your mother over me. You chose to live in a world where you didn't have to face the truth. And now you have to live with the consequences of that. I'm not here to fix it for you." Jason stood there, frozen, his eyes filled with regret. But it was too late. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to be the one to fix him. I wasn't going to be the one to bear the weight of his mistakes. With a final, lingering glance, I turned and walked away, leaving Jason and Veronica standing in the ruins of the life they thought they had built. It was over. The fallout had begun, and Jason would have to face the reality of his choices, just as Veronica would have to face the fact that the control she had so carefully maintained was slipping through her fingers. And as I stepped out of the room, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The storm had passed, and the truth had set me free. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. It was as though the entire world had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. And now, in the aftermath of the confrontation, everything seemed to settle into an eerie stillness. Jason and Veronica had retreated into their separate corners, and I, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was left with nothing but the peace of my own thoughts. I didn't rush. I didn't feel the need to act hastily, to make some grand gesture or explanation. I had already said everything that needed to be said. The truth had come to light, and now it was time to let things unfold as they would. I was no longer tethered to Jason's world, no longer bound by his indecision and his mother's influence. I was free. As the days turned into weeks, I found a strange sense of satisfaction in the quiet. The hustle and bustle of my daily routine, something I had once considered mundane, now felt like a luxury. I spent my time focusing on what truly mattered: my business, my future, and most importantly, myself. The weight that had once rested so heavily on my shoulders now felt like a distant memory, as if a storm had passed, leaving nothing but clear skies in its wake. It was almost too easy, this quiet victory. There were no tears, no dramatic confrontations, no pleading or begging. I had no desire for vengeance, no need to see Jason suffer. I simply allowed him and Veronica to stew in the mess they had created, while I moved forward with my life, unfazed and unbothered. But the calm, as peaceful as it was, never lasted long. There was always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, those unanswered questions about Jason and what he was going through. Would he come to his senses? Would he realize the mistakes he had made? Or was he too far gone, too consumed by the world Veronica had created for him to ever truly break free? I didn't have the answers, and honestly, I didn't care anymore. The woman I had been before the storm had already been reshaped into someone stronger, someone who no longer needed to prove herself. My empire, the one I had built from the ground up, was thriving. My team was expanding, my success was undeniable, and the only thing left for me to do was to continue living, to continue growing. I spent the evenings alone in the comfort of my home, savoring the solitude that now surrounded me. It was a far cry from the tension that had once permeated these walls, and as I sat in the quiet of the night, I couldn't help but smile to myself. Veronica had underestimated me. Jason had too. And yet, here I was, standing tall and unshaken, while they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. The phone calls, the texts, the constant attempts to reach me, they all went unanswered. Jason's messages grew more desperate as the days went by. At first, they were filled with apologies, promises of change, of doing better, of trying harder. But as the weeks turned into months, his tone shifted. His words became more frantic, more pleading, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. And Veronica? She wasn't any better. Her carefully constructed facade of control had cracked, and the cracks were widening with each passing day. I knew she must have been telling herself that she could fix things, that she could somehow bend reality to suit her desires, but deep down, I knew she could feel it, too. The inevitable collapse was coming. The illusion of control was fading. But I wasn't interested in their struggles. I had already walked away, and nothing they did or said could change that. They had made their choices, and I was already moving on. Then one evening, as I sat in my living room, the soft glow of the city lights casting long shadows across the floor, my phone buzzed. The message was from Jason, though this time it was different. There was no apology. There was no plea for reconciliation. Instead, it was a simple, almost resigned question. Are you happy now? The words stung, not because of the question itself, but because of the tone beneath it. It was the first time I had ever seen him truly vulnerable, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Jason wasn't asking me if I was happy for him, or if I had found peace. No, this time he was asking me if I was happy without him. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The answer was obvious. I was finally free, and as I put my phone down, leaning back into the soft cushions of the couch, I realized that this quiet victory, the one that had been so elusive for so long, was mine and mine alone. I didn't need validation from anyone else. I didn't need anyone's approval. All I needed was the knowledge that I had built my life on my own terms. That, in the end, was the sweetest victory of all. The calm that had settled over me was only temporary, I realized, as the inevitable confrontation loomed just beyond the horizon. It had been weeks since the truth had come to light, weeks since I had walked away, and still Jason hadn't fully grasped the weight of his actions. He had tried, in his own way, to reach out, to mend what he thought could be fixed. But the truth was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. One evening, I received a message. It was from Jason. It was the kind of message I had been expecting for a while now. A final attempt, the last-ditch effort to regain control of the situation, to pull me back into his orbit. The message was simple. Can we meet? It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an attempt to explain himself. It was just a question, hanging in the air like an unresolved chord. A question that Jason had asked himself 100 times but had never fully come to terms with. What had we lost? I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I sat back, my fingers hovering over the keys, deliberating for a moment. The truth was, I didn't need to meet with him. I didn't need to hear his words or listen to his excuses. But part of me wanted to see if he had finally come to understand the truth. The truth that wasn't just about money, or the house, or even his mother's control. It was about me, who I was, what I had built, and why I had chosen to walk away. Finally, I typed a simple response. We can meet. But understand this, Jason, nothing is going to change. I arranged the meeting for the following afternoon, at a cafe that had become one of my favorite spots in the city. It was quiet, calm, just the way I liked it. The atmosphere was a far cry from the storm that had raged only weeks before. I arrived early, finding a table by the window. The city stretched out before me, the world continuing on as if nothing had happened, as if the events of the past months were nothing but a distant memory. When Jason walked in, his face was pale, his shoulders tense. I could see it in his eyes. He was carrying the weight of everything that had unfolded. He walked up to the table, his eyes flickering nervously, as though he weren't sure what to say. Ella, he said quietly as he sat down, his voice barely above a whisper. There was an unfamiliar hesitation in his tone. I've been thinking about everything, about us. I didn't interrupt him, but I could feel the truth gnawing at me, waiting for him to finally understand. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words. He wanted to talk, but what was there to say? The damage had already been done. The lies had been exposed. And now we were left picking up the pieces. I was wrong, Jason finally said, his voice breaking slightly. I should have listened to you. I should have trusted you. But I let my mother. He trailed off, rubbing a hand over his face. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was just too blind to see the truth. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze fixed on him. His words, though sincere, didn't carry the weight they once would have. It was too late. The truth wasn't something that could be repaired with a few simple words. Jason, I said, my voice steady but firm, you were never the problem. I was never the problem. It was your mother's hold over you, the way she manipulated every decision you made. You were so wrapped up in her world, in her vision for your life, that you never took the time to see what was right in front of you. Me, us. Jason's face softened, but the guilt was still there, hanging in his eyes. I know, he whispered. I know. I'm sorry for everything, for not seeing you, for not believing in you. The words should have meant something, but they didn't. Not anymore. I had spent so much of my life trying to prove myself, trying to show him who I was, trying to make him see the value of what I had built. But the truth was, he never truly saw me. Not until it was too late. Jason, I continued, my voice unwavering. You can't undo the past. You can't go back and fix what was broken. You chose your mother over me, and now you have to live with that choice. I don't need you to fix anything. I don't need your apology. I've already moved on. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw him for what he truly was, lost. A man who had never learned how to stand on his own, who had always needed someone to guide him, to make decisions for him. And now, with everything crumbling around him, he was finally realizing what he had lost. But it was too little, too late. You don't understand, he said, his voice tight with frustration. I never meant for things to turn out this way. I never meant to hurt you. I know you didn't, I replied softly, my heart no longer heavy with anger or resentment. But it doesn't change anything. The truth is, you're not the person I thought you were. And that's something I can't fix for you. Jason's face twisted with emotion, but I couldn't offer him the comfort he was searching for. I had already made my peace with it. It was over. Goodbye, Jason, I said quietly, standing up from the table. He looked up at me, as if waiting for something more, but I knew there was nothing left to say. The truth had been unveiled, and with it, everything had been laid bare. There was nothing left to fix. As I walked away from him, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the final reckoning. And it was only when I finally turned my back on him, leaving him in the wake of his own choices, that I realized how truly free I had become. The aftermath was inevitable, but even so, it hit harder than I had anticipated. Jason's desperation was palpable, and it seemed to grow with each passing day. I had left him behind, yes, but he wasn't ready to let go. Not of me, not of the life he thought we could have had, and certainly not of the power that his mother had always promised him. It started with texts, dozens of them. At first, they were simple, almost pleading, filled with apologies. I didn't mean to hurt you, he wrote one morning, his words as fragile as his ego. I'm so sorry. Please, can we talk? I ignored them, every single one. The more he reached out, the more I realized how deeply his world was unraveling. And then came the phone calls. Late at night, when the silence of my apartment felt too heavy, his name would flash across my screen, his voice on the other end more frantic each time. Ella, please, I'm sorry. I've been thinking about everything. I've made a mistake. I'll fix it. I swear. I'll fix it. His voice cracked with desperation, but the more he begged, the more I remained unmoved. There was nothing to fix. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. I had already moved on. I was building something that mattered. I didn't need his apologies or his broken promises anymore. As the weeks wore on, his messages grew more desperate. They became an attempt to bargain, to offer solutions that would never be enough. I'll do anything, Ella. I'll change. We can start over, just the two of us. Please, I need you. I can't do this without you. But I could feel the underlying truth in his words, even if he couldn't say it aloud. He didn't need me. He needed security. He needed someone to fix the mess his mother had helped him create. Veronica, on the other hand, took a different approach. She was never one to beg, but her pride was her downfall. She didn't text or call me directly at first. No. Instead, she tried to manipulate the situation in the only way she knew how, by trying to control everything from behind the scenes. I could feel her presence in the way Jason would appear at my door, his shoulders slumped, his face tired and defeated, all because of the constant pressure his mother was putting on him. It was clear to me now. Veronica wasn't just trying to fix the situation for Jason. She was trying to salvage her own reputation. She had spent years constructing the perfect world for her son, a world where he was the center of everything, where his life was dictated by her expectations. And now that the world was crumbling around them both, she was scrambling to regain that control. But I wasn't about to let her do that. I had no time for her manipulations anymore. The more I saw Jason unravel, the clearer it became. He had never been in control of his own life. Veronica had controlled him, and now she was desperately trying to control me, but I wouldn't let her. One day, I received an unexpected message. It wasn't from Jason this time. It was from Veronica. The words were measured, calculated. But beneath them was the unmistakable desperation that had begun to surface in every part of her life. "Ella," she wrote, "I know you think this is about Jason, but it's not. You're making a mistake. You were always meant to be part of this family. If you just come back, we can fix everything. We can make it right." I read the message, letting the words sit there for a long time before responding. I didn't need to respond quickly. The power was mine now, and I wasn't going to rush into anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, I typed a simple response: "No, it's too late." And I deleted her message without a second thought. The truth was, Veronica had already lost. Her carefully constructed life, the one she had spent years controlling and molding to fit her desires, was unraveling right in front of her. Jason had lost everything that mattered. His job was gone, his reputation was in shambles, and most importantly, he had lost me. And Veronica? She had lost her hold over both of us. She had spent her life manipulating the people around her. But now, she was facing the consequences of that manipulation. No one in her circle wanted to associate with her anymore. They saw her for who she truly was. Days passed, and Jason continued to struggle. I could hear it in his voice when he called, in the way he spoke to me, as if he were trying to piece together the remnants of a life that no longer existed. But there was no going back. His world had fallen apart, and now he was left with nothing but the ashes of his own mistakes. The man who had once been so sure of himself was now a shadow of the person he used to be, lost and unsure of what to do next. As for Veronica, she retreated into the shadows. She had no power left, no influence. The family she had tried so desperately to control was slipping through her fingers, and all that remained was the hollow shell of her former life. She couldn't control me anymore, and she couldn't control Jason either. I, on the other hand, was thriving. My business was growing faster than I had ever imagined, and I had the freedom I had always wanted. The weight that had once been on my shoulders was now lifted, and I stood tall, unburdened by the past. I was no longer tied to a man who had never truly seen me, nor to a family that never understood my worth. Jason's desperation and Veronica's defeat were the final confirmations I needed. They had underestimated me, tried to manipulate me, and in the end, they had lost everything. And me? I had finally won. Not because I had taken something from them, but because I had taken my life back. And as I moved forward, with nothing holding me back, I realized that the real victory wasn't in the way I had left them behind. It was in the way I had finally learned to stand on my own, free from the shadows of their control. Months had passed since that final meeting with Jason, since the dust had settled and the world I had once known had completely shifted. Things were quieter now, but the peace was different this time. It wasn't the calm before a storm. It was the calm of true freedom. I had walked away from a life that was never meant for me, and in doing so, I had finally found myself. The changes in my life were undeniable. My business was flourishing, growing in ways I had only dreamed of before. My team, my supporters were loyal, dedicated, and shared my vision for what we could achieve. And I was stronger, more confident, and more at peace with who I had become than I had ever been before. The woman who had once doubted herself, who had tried so desperately to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for her, was now gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth, someone who had fought for everything she had achieved and wasn't afraid to stand tall, no matter who tried to tear her down. I still thought about Jason sometimes, the man I had once loved, the man who had never really seen me for who I was. His messages still haunted me occasionally, though I had long since stopped reading them. The desperation in his voice when he called, the way he tried to make it all right. He had no idea how much he had lost, and I knew that no apology, no excuse, could ever fix the damage he had done. He had made his choice, and in the end, that choice had led him down a path of self-destruction. I wasn't angry with him. In a way, I pitied him. He had never learned to stand on his own, and now he was paying the price for it. Veronica, too, had faded from my life. Her attempts to regain control, her attempts to manipulate the situation had all fallen flat. She was no longer a threat. Her carefully crafted image of power and influence had crumbled, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. The people who had once looked to her for guidance had turned their backs, and now she was left alone, trapped in a life she had built on lies and manipulation. She had spent her entire existence controlling others, but in the end, it was her own control that had slipped through her fingers. And that was something I couldn't help but find satisfying. But it wasn't just about what I had walked away from. It was about what I had gained. I had gained my freedom. I had gained the respect and admiration of those who had once doubted me. I had built something real, something lasting, and I had done it all on my own. I didn't need Jason, I didn't need Veronica, and I certainly didn't need anyone who had ever tried to tear me down. I was enough just as I was. The best part of it all? I didn't have to fight for anything anymore. I didn't need to fight for a place in a family that never understood me. I didn't need to fight for love from a man who had never truly seen me. All I had to do was stand tall and let my success speak for itself. I had already won. As I stood in front of my boutique one evening, watching the sunset over the city skyline, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was my life now. A life I had built, a life I had earned. And it was mine completely and utterly. The freedom I had longed for, the strength I had once doubted, were now a part of me. I had triumphed not because I had taken something from Jason or Veronica, but because I had taken everything I had once given away myself. And in doing so, I had found a version of myself that I had never even known was possible. A version of me who was strong, independent, and unshakable. A version of me who no longer needed the approval of anyone to feel complete. The world was mine now, and I was ready for whatever came next. Of course, here's the continuation of the story in English. Though I had achieved great success, there were still moments of quiet where I found myself reflecting on the past. On those long nights when the only sound was the gentle breeze outside my window, I sometimes wondered if I had truly left everything behind. But then, I would smile to myself, realizing that nothing in this journey was without purpose. Every decision, every challenge I had faced had led me to this point, where I not only had a thriving career but also the freedom I had always longed for. One day, as I sat in my office, preparing for an important meeting, I received an unexpected call. It was Jason. I felt a flicker of surprise at first, but quickly realized that I wasn't feeling anything more than calm. He was still clinging to the remnants of the past, but I knew I couldn't be the one to heal him anymore. "Ella, can we talk for a moment?" His voice, though still familiar, was laced with hesitation. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence stretch. Finally, I sighed and decided not to let my emotions control me. "Jason, I'm busy, but what do you need?" I just want to apologize," he said, his voice soft and shaky. "I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong. Please, I don't expect you to forgive me. but I want you to know that I regret everything." I looked out the window, watching the city below as the sun began to set. My life had changed so much since then. I had walked away from a life that was never meant for me, and in doing so I had found myself. "Jason," I said, my voice steady, "you don't need to apologize anymore. I forgave you a long time ago, both for you and for myself. But I can't go back to the past." A long silence followed. I could hear him struggling to find the words, but he wasn't ready yet to truly face the truth. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. About how far I had come and how much I had grown since the time I had spent trying to please him. I thought we could fix things," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I thought everything would be okay if I just made things right." I leaned back in my chair, looking at him through the phone as if he were sitting in front of me. "Jason, it was never about fixing things. It was about me, about us. And I've learned that I can't keep trying to fix something that was never meant to work. You chose your mother over me, and now you have to live with that choice. I've already moved on." His shoulders slumped on the other end of the line, the weight of my words sinking in. For the first time, I saw him for what he truly was. A man who had never learned to stand on his own, who had always relied on someone else to make decisions for him. And now, with everything crumbling around him, he was finally realizing what he had lost. But it was too late. "I'm sorry, Ella," he whispered, almost to himself. "I never realized. I never saw it until now." I didn't respond right away. There was nothing more to say. He was not the man I had once loved, and I wasn't the woman I had been when I first met him. I had grown stronger, and I didn't need to look back anymore. "Goodbye, Jason," I said softly, my voice calm, not out of anger, but simply because I knew it was time. "Take care of yourself." As I ended the call, I felt a strange sense of peace. This was it. The closure I had been waiting for. No more games, no more trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. The final reckoning had come, and I had walked away from it all unburdened and free. Days passed, and Jason's desperation only seemed to grow. His texts became more frequent, his calls more urgent. But the more he reached out, the more I realized that I was done. I was free, and nothing could pull me back into that life. Veronica, too, had faded into the background. Her attempts to regain control, her attempts to manipulate the situation, all fell flat. She had lost her grip, and now there was nothing left for her to control. She had spent years orchestrating a world around her son, but now that world was crumbling, and all she had left was the bitter realization that her power had slipped away. I, on the other hand, was thriving. My business was growing faster than I ever imagined. My team was stronger, and my confidence was unwavering. I had built something real, something that could never be taken away from me. I was no longer tied to a man who couldn't see me, nor to a family that never understood my worth. And as I stood before my boutique one evening, watching the sunset over the city, I felt a sense of peace that I had never known before. This was my life now, a life I had created, a life that was mine. I didn't need validation from anyone. I didn't need their approval. I had everything I needed, and I was ready for whatever came next. I had triumphed, not because I had taken anything from Jason or Veronica, but because I had taken everything back that I had once given away. And in doing so, I had found a version of myself that was strong, independent, and unshakable. A version of me who didn't need to fight for a place in anyone's world anymore. The best part of it all? I didn't have to fight for anything. I had already won. Life had become a rhythm, a steady pulse of success and quiet contentment. The world I had once feared I couldn't exist in was now the one I commanded. Every day brought new challenges, but also new victories, small and large, that reminded me of how far I had come. But even in this new life I had built for myself, there was a part of me that still looked back. Not with regret, not with longing, but with a curious reflection on what had happened and what I had learned. It wasn't just about the business or the fame or the wealth that I had accumulated. It was about the transformation of the person I had become. I no longer cared about fitting into a mold that wasn't meant for me. I was the mold, and I would define who I was. I had moments of loneliness, as anyone does, There were nights when I missed the feeling of being truly seen, the comfort of someone who could share my victories and failures. But those moments were fleeting, because I realized, in those quiet hours, that I had everything I needed within myself. I had everything I had ever wanted: freedom, independence, success, and most importantly, the clarity of mind to never again allow anyone to diminish who I was. Then, one day, as the world continued on around me, I ran into someone who made me realize just how much I had grown. It was Melissa, the young woman Veronica had once paraded around as a better match for Jason. I saw her in the entrance of my boutique, standing hesitantly near the door as if unsure of herself. Her presence felt almost like an echo of the past, and as I watched her, I saw the woman she had once been, the woman Veronica had tried to mold into a perfect daughter-in-law. She caught my eye and smiled faintly, as if sensing my gaze. Her smile was different now, softer. Not the arrogant, confident grin of someone trying to fit into a place they didn't belong, but rather a look of genuine humility. She walked up to me, her steps hesitant, but resolute. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I used to believe everything Veronica told me, that you weren't good enough, that you were somehow inferior. But I see now how wrong I was." Her words caught me off guard, but in the best way possible. I didn't hold any resentment toward her. After all, she had only been a pawn in Veronica's game, just as I had once been. But there was something deeply satisfying in hearing those words from someone who had once been manipulated by the same woman who had tried to control my life. "I'm sorry for the way I judged you," Melissa continued, her eyes meeting mine with a sincerity I hadn't expected. "I saw what you built, and I realized that I could never have had what you have because you built it on your own terms. And I respect that more than anything now." I smiled at her, not out of pride, but out of understanding. "It's not about proving others wrong, Melissa. It's about proving to yourself that you can do it, no matter what anyone else thinks." She nodded, a quiet understanding passing between us. In that moment, I realized something that I hadn't truly acknowledged before. It wasn't just about what I had achieved. It was about the fact that others, people who had once underestimated me, doubted me, or tried to tear me down, were starting to see me for who I truly was. That recognition was more meaningful than any material success. As we talked more, Melissa shared that she had also been trying to build her own life, stepping out from under the shadow of Veronica's expectations. It seemed that, in the end, we were both breaking free from the same chains, but in different ways. Before we parted ways, she gave me a warm, genuine smile. "I just wanted to say thank you for showing me what true strength looks like." I didn't need to respond with words. I simply smiled back, knowing that the journey we had both been on had shaped us into people who would never again shrink or be diminished by the opinions of others. Walking back into my boutique, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't just about the life I had built. It was about the legacy I would leave behind, the kind of woman I had become, the kind of woman who had learned to trust herself, who had learned that true success came not from anyone else's validation, but from within. The truth was, I had already won. Not just in the business world, not just in the eyes of those who had once doubted me, but in my own heart. I had triumphed because I had learned to stand on my own, to build something that mattered, and most importantly, to never allow anyone else to define me again. The storm had passed, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident than ever. And as the sun set once more over the city, I realized that the best was yet to come. This was only the beginning. As the days went by, the city outside my boutique grew brighter with opportunity, and I found myself moving through life with a quiet confidence that was hard to ignore. The business was thriving, but more importantly, I was thriving. The work that once felt like an endless climb now felt like a smooth, steady ascent. It wasn't just about the success anymore. It was about the peace I had finally found within myself. The peace that came from knowing I didn't need anyone's approval to define my worth. I had learned to enjoy the small moments. The feeling of sitting in a coffee shop, watching the world bustle around me, and knowing that I had earned my place in it. The late-night walks under the city lights, where I could let my thoughts wander without worrying about what anyone else thought of me. I had freedom, not just in my career, but in every part of my life. The kind of freedom that came from owning every choice, every step, every victory, and every mistake. But even in this space of growth, there were times when I reflected on the past with a sense of understanding. Not resentment, but understanding of how much I had learned, and how far I had come. Jason, for all his desperate attempts to reach me, was still lost in the chaos of his own making. I had heard from mutual friends that he had tried to rebuild his life, to find his footing again. But it was never going to be the same for him. He had always been in the shadow of his mother, never truly learning how to stand on his own. And that was a lesson he would have to learn the hard way. As for Veronica, I never heard from her again. I had expected some final confrontation, some desperate attempt to reassert her control, but it never came. It was as though she had vanished from my life entirely. Maybe she finally realized that there was nothing left to control, or maybe she had moved on to her next victim. Either way, it didn't matter. I had learned the most important lesson: never let anyone control your narrative. Life wasn't without its challenges, of course. There were always hurdles to overcome, obstacles that would try to stop me from moving forward. But now, I faced them with a calm assurance. I had spent years building a life that was truly mine, and there was no one who could take that from me. Not Jason, not Veronica, not anyone. One evening, as I stood in front of my boutique, the same place where my journey had taken such an unexpected turn, I looked out over the city. The skyline stretched out before me, a sea of lights reflecting the dreams and ambitions of countless people. And in that moment, I realized that I was just one of those dreams, one of those people who had fought to make her own way in a world that didn't always make room for her. But I had made space. I had built my life on my own terms. The best part? I didn't have to explain it to anyone. I didn't have to justify my success, my choices, or my freedom to anyone. It was mine to own. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the streets, I finally understood something that I had never fully grasped before. I had not only built a business, I had built a life, my life, a life that was rich with experience, filled with hard-earned victories, and free from the shackles of anyone else's expectations. The victory wasn't just in what I had built or what I had gained. It was in who I had become. And the future? It was mine for the taking.